There is a world within us that we do not understand, a stranger that lives inside the very minds that we think we control. There is something to us that always, again, encounters us as foreign, that we don't seem to understand, that whenever we try to grab it, slips away faster than we can close our hands. This something is what we know from psychoanalysis as the unconscious. But although the unconscious is a very difficult friend to have live within us, there is a way to engage in dialogue with this friend. And this pathway, or let's say the golden path to the unconscious, is the engagement with dreams. Join me today in exploring dreams a little further, in looking at what psychoanalyst Carl Jung had to say about dreams, and in delving into ways of interpreting dreams, and perhaps not interpreting them, perhaps engaging with them as a way to get into dialogue with that which is strangest within us. Welcome everyone to this video. Welcome back to the channel if you're a subscriber already. If you're not, then perhaps consider to subscribe. We do discuss Jungian content on this channel in some depth. We go beyond Jung and discuss neuroscience, psychology, general philosophy, always with the intention or always with an eye on ways for self-development and ways to engage in precisely the dialogue that I've interluded in this little mystical introduction. Ways to move beyond what we think we are, beyond the control that we think we have of the psyche that we do not control after all, at least in the perspectives that we explore. Ways to move beyond, let's say, the mundane experience of reality within ourselves, and to unfold or develop into a world or a life with more awareness and more reflection. Dreams, as I attempted to interlude in these first few seconds, are one voice or one way, one pathway in which that which is strange within us speaks. But before we get into the analysis of dreams or ways to engage with them, let us briefly look at this stranger within us, right? And let us look at it from the perspective not only of psychoanalysis in general, but specifically the Jungian perspective, just for a moment before we get into the discussion of dreams in some more detail. So for psychoanalysts in general, psychoanalysts like Sigmund Freud, but then especially for Jung, the psyche is essentially split in two or more components, right? In two, though, or looking at the psyche split in two is enough for us today, as we'll get into the other components in other videos perhaps. But what for us is important today is that there is a conscious component and an unconscious component. Now, the conscious component is the kind of self-observation that you engage in every day. It includes, however, also the kind of ego that you think you are, right? So the kind of that which you tell others, including yourself, by the way, you are, right? If you say to someone, I am a soccer player, I like playing soccer, I like playing chess, I like playing, I don't know, poker, whatever you like playing, I like reading. You know, I have 3 kids, I'm a lawyer. Then essentially that's your consciousness speaking. But the consciousness speaking is also the kind of engagement with material that you are not familiar with, let's say learning, right? But a large part of that already is unconscious, right? Think about walking. You never think about walking, right? You never think about how to walk. You never think about how to play the piano. You never think about how to read. You can't reflect on these procedural tasks, right? So already on the level of memory, a lot is unconscious, but that's, properly speaking, that's not really the unconscious that psychoanalysis is talking about. When psychoanalysis speaks of the unconscious, it speaks of essentially those tentacles that control the ego that you think of consciously, right? those tentacles that reach out into, let's say, that puppeteer, if you will, that determine every movement that you make. And by determine, I don't mean that psychoanalysis necessarily has a deterministic approach to life, quite the contrary, but there is the idea very deeply rooted in psychoanalysis that the kinds of behaviors you engage in and the kinds of things you do in everyday life are not under your own control. That when you speak, it is not you that speaks, it is something that speaks through you. And I think what is very important here is that if you listen to someone speak very closely, which is the task of the analyst, at least in the Freudian paradigm, that's the core task of the analyst, to listen very closely, then what you hear is that something speaks over the voice of the ego, that there are two voices speaking, right? There's the voice of the ego, the kinds of things that, you know, that the patient attempts to say. It's like, oh, I meant to say this. And then there's that which they attempt to correct, you know, the sort of the negated, that which they attempt to correct, the slip of the tongue, the you know, the stuttering, what I just did, right? The stuttering, the overthinking, all of these sort of breaks within the flow of speech, right? The flow of speech being the attempted narration of a certain, let's say, element of the patient's reality, right? And the ego in that sense narrates itself, right? And you can observe this quite closely, right? When people are, you'd say, cornered, but cornered not really in the sense of, you know, you're cornering someone, but more in the sense of when they get to the limits or to the border spaces of their ego speech, they start making strange noises. They start speaking differently, right? There's something that speaks through their mundane speech, something that comes forth, right? Something that pierces through, if you will. And that something obviously is then called in psychoanalysis the unconscious. And that may be many things, right? It may be, you know, society or values speaking through you, some kind of conflict, some kind of friction between what you think is the right thing, right? What you're on the level of your ego, or better, on the level of different elements of that ego, what you think you should be saying, and then going beyond that, what actually comes through, what you've learned, you know, what there is to say, what sort of, what on a deeper level, what wants to be said, what wants to be heard. So for Jung, there would be a third level that comes through here, and that is the level of what has always been said, right? And that's different from the level of culture, different from the big other, let's say in Lacan, right? The kind of the cultural gaze that looks through you. And for Jung, that is the level of the collective, the level of the human evolution that has always been going on for thousands of years, right? The level on which humanity has always responded to certain things in a certain way. And that level speaks through you as much as your own history speaks through you for Carl Jung, right? And that is the level that Jung calls the archetypal level, right? That is the level where there is a stranger that goes beyond you, a stranger that goes beyond the history of the past few generations, your parents, your grandparents, and so on and so forth. Certainly, there would also be a third level, right, in this unconscious paradigm, the level of events that are simply like haunting humanity as spirits, if you will. You know, but those will be manifested, I think, in the first two levels, right? You can think of the Holocaust of an event. You can think of the kind of guilt and trauma that is embedded in that, right? But all these voices speak through you while you're speaking. It's almost like different lines of narration that are occurring at the same time, right? And there are many ways these speak, right? There are ways of speech of the collective in symbols, right? Language is not always verbal in that context. Language is not always manifested in the terms that we think of it at all, right? It could be a certain energy that manifests. It could be a numinous feeling. It could be something that occurs that you cannot explain, that happens to you that you cannot explain. And dreams, and now we'll get to dreams. Dreams are a very particular language that we can listen to when we attempt to establish a dialogue with the unconscious, right? But before we get to dreams in specific, let's just briefly look at why it is important to engage in this dialogue. The unconscious is not your enemy. The ego, however, acts as if it were. And in this regard, the ego and the unconscious are in a kind of antagonism, similar to the ego and the environment, right? I consider, and I've mentioned this in other videos, the environment, to some extent, emulating the ego, dancing with the ego in a kind of exchange where the ego attempts to defend itself from the forceful changes that nature dictates, that the environment dictates. The unconscious is similar to that, in the regard that the unconscious is an agent in which the ego is not able to exercise its control on a full level, right? The ego wants to maintain stability over time. It wants to maintain stability because this stability allows it to move across the environment and interpret it in a way that is useful for its own survival. Like, my hypothesis is that the ego has a strong survival instinct and attempts to maintain this instinct or carry it forth into the future by virtue of attempting to numb, as it were, the forces that influx into the ego. However, it is important or key to engage in dialogue with the unconscious, as it is key to engage in dialogue or delve into nature, delve into the kinds of forces that are active around us, because the ego has a tyrannical tendency. That is, the ego shutting itself off from that which it is not, threatens its own destruction, or has as a consequence the threat of its own destruction when the encounter with this unknown necessarily occurs. That's why it's important to engage with this, or engage in a dialogue with the unconscious, with nature, and so forth. And in addition, and this is the second reason, there is a truth within this unconscious realm that is a truth about us that is not accessible via the ego, right? You can access this truth only in a dialogue with the unconscious. And this truth for Jung is very difficult to grasp, right? It's very difficult to grasp. He calls it the self, right? And the question that emerges is the self something that goes beyond, sort of that goes towards an actual authenticity, or is it simply the going beyond of the ego, right? And I've brought this up in many other videos, and it's a real question to ask. It's a real tough question to ask, because it's a question of destiny ultimately. Like, is there something that is predetermined that you think that you have to arrive at? I'd be curious to learn what you think, right? Leave a comment if you want. Let's then finally get to dreams, right? Why and how to engage with dreams, and why are dreams important to engage with in the first place? Okay, so dreams. The first thing we have to look at when it comes to dreams is their origin, right? Like, why do we dream? And that's a difficult question to answer, and many different areas of science have given different answers. But if we look at the very fundamental hypotheses from neuroscience, dreams occur essentially because there is, especially dreams, occur in REM sleep, and REM sleep is the kind of sleep that we engage in when regenerating or cleaning up, as it were, the debris within the brain. So regenerating, as it were, processing the experiences we had at a given point in time during a day, but more than that, integrating them with experiences that have previously occurred. So kind of pruning neuronal connections towards a useful restart of the day. That's why sleep is key, right? Sleep is important because on the one hand, And we sleep a lot because we have very large brains, right? Like we wouldn't sleep as much if we didn't have brains that were that large. And complex size is not as important as complexity, I think. But so we sleep essentially, and we dream especially, to process that which we've experienced and integrate that with previous experience. And what different is that from saying we attempt to integrate the kinds of novelty that we've encountered in the days that we spent with that which has been there before. So we attempt to establish that the speech, the kind of the ego speech that I've mentioned in the previous sections of this video, we attempt to reestablish that in the dream. So if you've had an experience, right, you know that probably yourself, right? If you've had an experience that was mildly traumatic during the day, or that was and maybe life-changing, good or bad, right? You'll say, let's sleep over it. Let's just sleep over it, and we'll get back to it tomorrow, right? And that instinct, or that call it an instinct, is essentially has exactly that origin. We wake up and we have a clearer picture, a clearer view on things. Sometimes not, but certainly the anxiety that we had the night before has shifted, right, to a large extent. And so let's look at what Jung had to say about dreams, and sort of go from there. So Jung writes here on dreams, he writes, before starting our discussion of the individual dreams, he writes this in Children's Dreams, so one of his seminars that he gave. Before starting our discussion of the individual dreams, I would like to make a few remarks on the method of dream interpretation. So that's what we're concerned with today, right? As you know, the dream is a natural phenomenon. It does not spring from a special intention, right? Very important, right? You don't intend to dream something, although there may be possibilities to address certain questions in the context of dreams, but we won't get into that. One cannot explain it with a psychology taken from consciousness. So that essentially just means that if you only hypothesize consciousness, which is your actions at will, you cannot explain dreams, because dreams don't occur at will. We are dealing with a particular way of functioning independent of the human's ego will, or the human ego's will and wishes, intention or aim. Precisely again, right? You cannot control the dream. You cannot say, I want to dream about a princess tonight, right? It doesn't work. It is an unintentional occurrence, just like everything occurring in nature, right? And that is, I think that is an important point, because Jung here, for the first time, sets a parallel between the dream and nature, between the dream and the natural environment, which will continue in his observations, especially of the Tao in the I Ching, and the observation of nature as a reflection of the motions in the collective unconscious, right? And therefore, nature as a potential source for dialogue with the collective unconscious. So we also cannot assume that the sky gets clouded only to annoy us. It simply is as it is. The difficulty is, however, to get a handle on that natural occurrence, so to attempt to understand it. It seems best to be as unprejudiced as possible when we let things influence us. Yet anything we have to say about the event is still our interpretation. We are in the same situation as any natural scientist who also deals with phenomena that do not reveal their meaning in conformity with a natural law, right? Like, you know, it's and I think this is Jung's genius, right? It's and that's here Jung, I think, and Freud's perspective differ interestingly, right? If you talk at least to contemporary Freudian or Lacanian analysts that I sometimes engage with, they seem to attribute a reality to the patient's reflection on the dream that goes beyond the reality of the dream itself. And for Jung, I think that relationship is reversed. The dream itself for Jung has a reality that we must decipher. And I think ultimately the truth is probably in the middle, right, where you say, well, the patient's reflection on the dream, the kind of dialogue about the dream, again reveals the kind of slips, the kinds of interruptions, that which is beyond the speech of the patient, as speech always reveals that which is beyond itself, while the dream itself, as far as we can even recall it properly, also reveals something that is beyond, right? Like the idea here is really that we have to be careful that when recalling a dream, we recall something and therefore we already distort it. So, but in that distortion is also an element of truth, right? And the more you talk and think about dreams, the more interesting the dream gets. And usually if you do this yourself, and if you're honest to yourself, you know something, you know what you distort in the dream in order to make it fit your own narrative, right? And I think that's quite interesting. That's quite something to say. So let's look at another quote from Jung on dream interpretation. This quote is not from Jung, but from James Hall on Jungian dream interpretation. He says, there are three major steps in the Jungian approach to dream interpretation: a clear understanding of the exact details of the dream, the gathering of associations and amplifications in progressive order on one or more of three levels, so personal, cultural, and archetypal, the placing of the amplified dream in the context of the dreamer's life situation in the process of individuation. Okay, so how does that, what does Hall mean? So first of all, again, note that this is vastly different from the Freudian approach, where essentially you would perhaps have step 2A, right? You have the association, the active association of the dream in the dialogue with the analyst. And again, I'm not saying this method of Jung's is sort of the method that we have to follow, and that's right. I think especially 2A is a very important aspect of the engagement with the dream, and I would moreover say that it probably precedes a one. So the first step, a clear understanding of the exact details of the dream, because again, how do you want to gather that clear understanding? It's very difficult. It's very difficult to remember, but you can train yourself to do it. But then again, if you train yourself to do it, you train your ego to do it. And the dialogue with the unconscious, I think, starts on the second level. And that is this the associations with yourself or on the personal level, and the amplifications. Amplification is essentially, and I've defined this in other videos in more detail, but amplifying is essentially zooming into certain elements of the dream. So if the dream contained a dog, right, or a dog that somehow looked strangely, you may zoom into it. You may amplify the dog and find that it's symbolizing, a beast, and it actually has three heads. And why is that? And what does the number 3 mean? And how is this used in the cultural context? And what was your own context with the dog? And and again, I would, on the personal level, so 2A, I would say engage with the dream here, not only on the level of, oh my God, yeah, well, I have a dog, and my parents had a dog, and oh my God, that's so profound. That free association is actually letting your thoughts freely flow, entirely freely, without any prejudice, right? Without any kind of structure. It's very difficult. Free association is a very difficult thing to do. And you can do this in writing, you can do this in art, you can do this in a dialogue, right? Best would be in a dialogue with an analyst or with someone who listens closely. And again, when someone listens, pay attention to the kinds of gaps. Pay attention to that which is not the kind of narrative that you build. It's always that which is not, that which falls out. But sometimes it's also that which is not, right? It's very important to listen. It's close listening, and it's extremely difficult. Especially in a dialogue with someone you're in a relationship with, be it a friend or a parent or a spouse, The cultural and the archetypal level, obviously, are attempting to go back further in time, within the culture that you live in, right? The kind of religion that you engage with, the kind of, people that you're in a context with, and then the archetypal level, right? Human history as such, or symbolic history as such, can you find something there? And by the way, artificial intelligence could be a very powerful tool to explore these kinds of levels, right? Because you don't know your own culture. But the whole idea also of the Jungian analysis, to a large extent, is to go to delve into your own culture and into the archetypal fundaments of that, and to engage with it. Like, we don't know anything about our histories and about, most of us, right? The majority. Let alone the archetypal fundaments of them. So engaging with it is very worthwhile, right? And you can do that. You can do this infinitely, to an infinite level of depth, right? And this will ultimately return you to something within you that has been lost, right? It's the story of the lost. It's the Gnostic story of the boy who lost, who I don't remember what he lost, but it's also the story, by the way, and I've changed this story a little bit, but I tell my daughters the story of the Frog King a little differently. It's a princess who used to play with a ball, and she used to be at the, sitting by a lake, and she lost the ball and she dropped the ball in the lake, and she lost it, and she was sad, and no one could dive into the lake to get it out for her. Her father couldn't, her mother couldn't. They were all scared of the lake. No one in the village or in the kingdom would do it, right? And she lost it, and she forgot about it. She used to go to the lake every day to play with the ball. She forgot about it after time, and and on the day she was supposed to get married, she was appalled by all the men. Like, she didn't like them at all. Didn't want to get married to them, and she went out to the lake, and she hadn't gone out to the lake for a while, but she went down, and the moon was shining, and she saw a fish laying on the sort of the quay, or the whatever, the shore, or whatever it is, right? And or the bridge that's there, and she went up to the fish, and the fish was almost dying, right? He was choking, and she just took the fish and threw it back into the water, and the fish came back out and gave her the ball, right? Without her expecting it. And I don't know, I don't know, again, I made up the story, but it's similar to a Gnostic story, where the Gnostic story is a little different, if I remember correctly, and I don't remember the name even, but it's the story of a boy. He's the son of a king. He goes to the south, somewhere into the desert. He forgets his culture. He gets kind of like Sodom and Gomorrah kind of thing. And one day he gets a letter from his father that says, doesn't it say I think it says he has to search for something. I should have, this is rant. See, again, this is free association. I didn't prepare this, but I can prepare the story, I'll prepare the story for another video. But the verdict is kind of, he's reminded of what he truly is. He finds what he truly is, and he returns to the kingdom as king, and so on and so forth. And the idea of the princess story is there's something she lost which made her unable to be what she's supposed to be, right? and then something she lost, right, is the unconscious, right? It's something within that wants to be integrated, that she lost, right? And something that she had when she was a child, something that came in the changing. And Freud puts this beautifully in one of his books, and he writes, like, I'm interested, he says along those lines, I'm interested in what happens when girls become women, right? What happens? What the hell happens? There are these girls that are happy. And I know this, like I said, so many, girls that I know, right? They're happy. They're the happiest girls when they're young. And then they become women. And you're like, what happened? And it's the same with men, obviously. They're playful boys and everything, and then they become men. And what happens? What happens? And then all the neurotic tendencies and whatever and whatnot take root, right? That this is neurosis in the end. The question is, what happens, right? And I think this is so interesting. And once again, the further we go back, the further we dive down, right? If we dare, and especially in this princess story with the ball, no one dares to dive down. No one dares to go into the depths of the water. It's scary. It's a scary place. It's a scary place to look back at who you are. Personally, Culturally and archetypally, it's a very scary journey, I would say. And it's scary for your ego. That's what it's scary for. It's scary for your ego because your ego is opposed to looking at itself, to having itself looked at by that which has always looked at it, right? It highlights that the ego has never been what it is, what it pretends to be, right? It highlights that there's nothing about the ego that it pretends what it pretends to be, or perhaps that it's precisely what it pretends to be, right? This violent something that pretends to be alive, a corpus, a rotting corpus, if you will, to some extent, right? Okay, well, let's conclude this video, I would say. Thank you for watching. It's much appreciated. And once again, I would encourage you to leave a comment below this video if you enjoyed it, or if you didn't enjoy it, please just let me know what you thought and let me know your own experiences with dream interpretation. I hope this was of some help. The engagement with dreams, in my opinion, it's difficult, and I think it's much more important to, again, attempt to listen and be listened to. And dreams will come by themselves, right? They always do. We always dream. You know, it's not. I don't think it's some secret source of truth. I think very quickly dreams can be taken as something we can control and understand, and I think far from it. I think we can understand dreams, let alone control them. That's again the ego attempting to it's the ego's fear of losing control. So again, thank you very much for interacting with this video. I very much appreciate it, and I would appreciate a like. And by the way, if you're interested, if you're still watching, if you're interested in learning more about this, I do have a reading list that I put together that you can download for free if you fill out a form that you can find in the description of the video below. And so if you're interested in engaging with Jung and beyond Jung, far beyond Jung, then please go ahead and download that reading list. I'd much appreciate you learning more and then being able to interact more with these videos, and that'll be cool. You know, it's a journey that we're on, all of us are together, right? So take care.